So this is the back half strategy lecture, and we're going to be talking about how to best give like summary and final focus speeches and how to construct the front half of the debate to best win in the back half. The first thing we have to talk about is case and rebuttal construction because I think that the front half of the debate overwhelmingly determines what the back half will look like. For example, in this case, argument choice matters, and there are some strategic things that you can do on the affirmative and the negative side in order to best maximize your chances of winning later. In terms of the AF, you should try to read one or two arguments that solve or like non-unique slash thump the negative argument. So, for example, this can look like reading a most likely implementation claim that would answer negative arguments, and I'll talk about like more examples later on. But an example of this being true would be the instability AF that I read on the Somaliland topic that was cut by Tristan. And essentially, what it says is that the most likely implementation of the affirmative is that Somaliland would have to consent or say yes to, was that Somalia, sorry, would have to say yes to Somaliland leaving, which fiats away the like invasion disad, which was a really common neg argument. Another thing that you can do is make like a uniqueness trick, kind of, which is that all of the negatives arguments are inevitable. So on the France nuclear sharing topic, which was like not chosen, but I already started prepping for it, I cut an AF that was like um, nuclear sharing agreements, etc., and defense cooperation is already happening in the status quo, but the plan implements a unique form of nuclear sharing agreement that is better than what the status quo is. So this essentially had the benefit of saying if the negative arguments are that nuclear sharing is bad, it's already happening now, so it is try or die for the AF for a better form of nuclear sharing that solves back for all the negatives arguments, which is super strategic because it means you can say the negatives arguments happen now, so it's try or die AF. On the negative, you should try not to read arguments that contradict with AF uniqueness. So, for example, if someone reads like an AF that says Russia war is inevitable, you probably shouldn't say that the plan caused Russia war because that would just like be like you would just instantly lose uniqueness essentially. And in terms of sort of what types of arguments you should actually read, you should read defensive arguments such as like circumvention or hidden links. So, in terms of how this works, is that you can say that, for example, voting affirmative has no effect because policymakers will just undo the act later, or that voting affirmative takes forever to be implemented, which is an argument that a lot of people have made on this topic about reversing Brexit. People make the argument that it takes forever, which is also like defense to all of the app scenarios. And another thing you can do on the negative is read like these hidden link arguments, which are just basically other scenarios that you don't explicitly delineate. So we did this on the Somaliland topic, and essentially we read a cohesion DA about like how recognizing Somaliland would destroy cohesion within the African Union, and that is bad for economic growth. But inside, we hid one card that was tagged something like that causes infighting or something. But it was like this Jabrimla card that said that the AF would greenlight secessionist movements across the entire African Union, which independently causes war. So actually, in a round we debated at Emory, someone ended up like completely dropping this argument. So we just went for it, and it was like the argument was conceded. In terms of rebuttal, I think that largely the way people do rebuttal is correct, where they're just like reading defense and like non-uniques and stuff. But I think that impact turns and defense are super underrated because most PF impact cards are like terrible. Like I've genuinely just seen impact cards that are like researchers estimate pandemics cause extinction. Like that is obviously not a warrant, and any warrant that says that pandemics don't cause extinction would immediately zero that impact. So I think if you especially run into impacts like this, like pandemics, for example, or democracy, which in my opinion are terrible impacts, you can definitely just like impact defense, read impact defense, or just straight up impact turn the argument, be like, pandemics are good, they solve nuclear war, or like democracy is bad because democracy causes conflict, which are some common impact turns. And I know, for example, on the Somaliland topic, once again, that a lot of teams were reading democracy bad to impact turn the governance aft that a lot of people were reading. I also think that if you're on the negative in rebuttal, you should be answering af uniqueness, even in some way, at least in some way, so that they don't get access to try or die, which I'll talk more about actually like right now in the summary section. So, in summary, in my opinion, you should go for 1 to 2 pieces of offense, and especially if you're efficient, you should try to go for two contentions or two pieces of offense, like a contention or a turn, because this would really time pressure the second summary or first final focus into having to respond to two arguments instead of just one, and they also have to weigh against both of those arguments, meaning that you most of the time get a positive time trade-off, or at least you get to pressure them into not like doing other things as well. Um, and in terms of choosing what arguments to go for, you should try to go for arguments that like theirs can try not to go for arguments that theirs can like obviously answer or turn. So, for example, if you can see defense on like a deterrence AF or something that Russia will attack now, you obviously shouldn't go for the escalation DA that the AF causes Russia to attack because it's non-unique, which means they can just cross-apply uniqueness and be like it's try or die. Or if you go for, let's say, I don't have an example. Let's see. If you go for an impact that's like food security, but the negative has like a faster like impact that definitely turns that argument, then you obviously shouldn't go for that impact because it allows them to easily set up time frame and turns case. And this is why actually I don't like impact filters or like democracy as a whole as an impact because like war, nuclear war, and like all of the basically every impact can be implicated to turn democracy or like EU relations, for example. So in my opinion, you should not really go for those impacts. Or if you have those impact scenarios, you should also have an external impact scenario that is not as easily turned. So, in terms of weighing, I think that different sides have different advantages. For example, on the negative team, like as the negative team, you pretty much should always win like time frame weighing. You should be like our argument happens before theirs. I just think that it's the nature of the negative to win time frame. And on the AF, some things that you can do are like try or die, like extinction's inevitable now, so the only risk of solvency is the AF. And something that we actually really like to do is this quantifiable slash delineated time frame argument. So, for example, on the Taiwan topic, which was like November and December of 2024, we read a UUV's AF that was like UUVs will be deployed at the end of the year, which prevents an existential threat to China's second strike capability. And we would do this meta weighing that's like you should prefer a quantifiable time frame because A, it minimizes judge intervention. Having clear numbers to compare means that the judge does not have to intervene as to what they think is faster. And B, it's also just more specific. So even if you know their impact happens fast, only you know that our impact happens at exactly X time. So that is an AF. I feel like more affirmative teams have like I feel like the nature of the affirmative is that quantifiable time frame. Is that they get access to this quantifiable time frame argument because they can say uniqueness means like this impact happens at X date. And you should be looking for cards that generally say that. Another thing that I really want to talk about here is risk analysis because I actually think it's super underrated. And I also think that a lot of PF judges are like, I don't know, they just don't understand the nature of risk, which is really confusing to me. Like, a lot of judges will be like, oh, you won the Wang. So even though the AF case is at like 100%, but the net case is at like 1%, I still vote neg because you won the Wang. Like, that's just not how debate works. And I don't understand why some PF judges are like that, which is why I think like risk analysis is an argument that you can make, but you really have to flesh out in like meta way. So this is kind of a probability weighing argument, and essentially what it says is that you should treat no impact as 100%, i.e., even if we concede uniqueness, you should just treat that impact as likely but not 100%, and we still get to compare which two impacts are more likely. So for example, if there were two conceded impacts, let's say the app says that great power war is inevitable now from China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, etc., all across the globe. But the negative is only going for like a US pandemics argument. The app can say that their impact outweighs on scope, which compounds into probability because it's more likely that all of these countries start nuclear war than like one instance of pandemics isolated to the United States. And then you can do meta weighing off of probability and be like, our argument is more probable and probability comes first because if an argument doesn't happen, it doesn't matter. And people's answer to this argument will just be like, oh, this is new defense. But the way you should implicate probability weighing isn't like this is defense to the AF or neg. It's that it's just comparison between which two impacts are more likely, which at the very worst you can use to like break the tie between between two impacts if you think that the time frame weighing is super, super close. Another argument that I think is very good to make in the back half is a link turns case argument. So at the TOC and at the King Round Robin, we read a Russia DA that was like investing in nuclear energy signals to investors that oil will be worthless soon, causing them to immediately, causing like oil suppliers to immediately sell as much oil as possible in order to get in order to get rid of all of it at once, right? And we made the argument that the link alone is sufficient to turn the case because if oil floods the entire market, like if supply goes up, like Economics 101 says that if supply increases, price goes down. And because price goes down, essentially the oil that's flooding the market becomes more competitive with nuclear energy, which causes people to want to use oil instead rather than like using nuclear energy. So it prevents integration of nuclear energy, which is a logical prerequisite for any of the affirmatives like impacts to be solved. Now, the third part of summary is extending deep. And sorry, quickly back to the link turns case stuff. I think that this is super strategic because even if you don't win the impact, it allows you to say that winning our link alone is sufficient for none of their arguments to happen. So at the very worst, you vote neg on presumption because we have won that like our link is true, right? Okay. Next is extending defense. So I think that you should always choose the most intuitively true or hard to answer thing to extend. For example, if you have a response that's like, let me think. Like if one is ludicrous and one is not, like the intuitive response is more true, meaning that the front line is probably better. So, meaning that the front line is probably worse. Like, for example, against a Russia argument, let's say you read two pieces of defense. The first is that Putin is like a nice person and will not attack NATO. And the second is that Putin does not want to risk getting himself killed because he doesn't want to start a nuclear war. Like, unless the first response is entirely conceded, I would almost always go for the second response because that is obviously the more true response and also a more defendable position than Putin is super nice. So I think that something like that, you want to always choose a more intuitive response to go for, even if they spend like slightly more time on that response, because that argument will always be more true, so the front lines will be more fake. Obviously, this is a case by case thing, where people, well, this is like a case by case thing where if they have a really true response to an argument, um you shouldn't really like just go for that, and you should just go for the one that seems easier to go for. Let's see. Okay, now on specific sides, I think that the negative should always extend uniqueness because winning any risk that their uniqueness is incorrect means that they cannot say try or die. And try or die, in my opinion, is one of the better affirmative weighing mechanisms. Even though I don't like personally think it's true, like on a technical level, it is a very good argument you can make. And you should directly also implicate uniqueness defense. You should be like, look, we have extended defense to their uniqueness, meaning they cannot go for try or die because try or die assumes that their impact is inevitable, but that's obviously not true. On the affirmative, you should not only extend normal defense, but in my opinion, you should also extend like implicate responses as mitigation to their time frame. So, for example, there's like a warming impact defense card that also says that best case scenario, warming triggers by 2100. Now, even if they answer every single other warrant in that card, be like, warming is real, warming does cause extinction, you should be like, we agree that warming might cause extinction, but it happens in 2100, which zeroes the affirmative time frame, and which zeroes the negative time frame, for example, because it means that their impact is so far out. And that means that you don't need to necessarily win defense if you win mitigation to their time frame, and if you win that your argument on the app, for example, outweighs on time frame. So the final thing I have to talk about is final focus. And in my opinion, like 95% of the time, final focus is basically a victory lap. So sounding ethosy, like sounding good and sounding ethosy matters a lot here because it is the last thing that your judges will hear and thus the thing that they'll remember the most. And most of the time you've already won at this point, unless like you pull off some really crazy salvage the round thing, but usually that doesn't happen. So most of the time you're already ahead or you're already behind. And you should just make the speech sound as good as possible. And something that I think you can do is go slower than you would used to. Definitely do not go top speed because if you go slow, the judge will like that. It's easier for them to flow, and you also naturally sort of sound better if you're talking slowly. So you should try to do that for final if you have enough time. In terms of what to go for in final focus, offense wise, you should go for like one argument only because there's so many time constraints. And Wang, you should always like make sure to meta weight or say why your Wang mechanism comes before theirs. For example, two common meta weighing mechanisms for time frame are that A, intervening actors can solve their argument in the future, so you should always prevent the earliest existential risk because that presents the least time for people to solve it in the future. And B, living longer is better because it increases value of life. Like obviously, I want to live till like I'm like 80 or 90 years old compared to like dropping dead now, meaning that living longer maximizes happiness. And in terms of try or die, um you can there's like a few complicated weighing mechanisms that you can go for here. The first is that even a 1% chance of extending humanity for as long as possible outweighs only like getting like humans to live a few more months, right? So let's say the AF uniqueness is one and that you want some defense to the neg link. That means that yes, voting AF has a chance to cause extinction. But if you don't vote AF, extinction is inevitable. So in the negatives world, you can at most delay extinction, whereas the affirmative is the only chance to have humanity live for as long as possible and save like infinite future generations, which maximizes expected well-being and turns the negatives like value to life claim on time frame. Another more fake but more simple argument you can make is that because humanity is like constantly expanding, living longer is like getting if extinction is inevitable, then getting people to live longer is actually worse because in the future more people will die. Now, I actually really don't like this argument because I think it's super fake, but it takes like 2 seconds to make, and we actually did win a round at the TOC on this meta weighing mechanism somehow. So I guess it like works out because people usually don't answer, or if they answer, it's super blippy. In terms of extending like defense, you should choose less to extend, usually only one response, maximum two, but implicate them really well and be like, this definitely answers their argument. And yeah, I think that also if there's like a super conceited argument, like they just drop terminal defense or something, you should start with that in the debate and be like, starting on their case, they have entirely dropped terminal defense, meaning, and then like extend it, implicate it, and then be like, that means any risk that our argument is true means you auto vote out, for example, and you can get the extending defense out of the way because in that case, extending conceded terminal defense would be the most important thing that your final focus can do because even if you like somehow mess up everything else, if you extend that terminal defense correctly, at the very worst, you're getting like a presumption ballot for one side, right? And another thing that you can do, this ties more back to like the ethos thing, is that you can quickly summarize the debate at the end. You can be like, look, they have conceded an argument and they've conceded it outweighs on time frame. So you should auto vote negative because there's literally a conceded argument. Like in the last 10 seconds of the debate, kind of just talk to the judge and be like, look, this was dropped and like use ballot directive language. So be like, this is exactly how you vote. You can write this on your ballot, etc. And judges like that because it makes their lives easier and tells them like exactly what to do. Because I know at least me personally as a judge and a lot of other judges are lazy and they want to make the quickest decision possible or the cleanest decision possible in order to like look good. So they would usually just look for the easiest place to vote. Another thing you can do, I guess I'll quickly talk about sort of like salvaging the round, where you're pretty behind coming out of summary and your final focus really needs to clutch up. So some things that you can do in this case are that you kind of have to like make some new cross applications, but you should identify which cross applications you can make or which concessions you can make that would necessarily like look really bad for them. So for example, if they have made an argument that's like Putin doesn't want to attack, but also made an argument that Russia war is inevitable, you can try to concede that argument. You can be like, look, they made both of these arguments that obvious and they're contradictory. That obviously means we get to choose which one to concede, and then concede the one that's better for you in order to like sort of get out of the argument that you think is so threatening. And this sort of just requires you to go new in final, but I think that you can definitely get away with it. So I think a good example of this is the outreach demo debate that I did a while ago, where I went for Spark. And what actually happened was that there was no weighing in summary at all as to why animal suffering necessarily outweighs. But I got away somehow with saying that like animal suffering outweighs on magnitude because And like the second final focus just never answered that claim. So we ended up winning on a 4-1 decision. Another thing that you can do in final focus, I guess like one last tip is just sort of saying like using like preempt if your first final focus, you should sort of preempt second final focus. So I think the outreach demo debate is another good example of that because I was like, they're gonna get up and say that pandemics also cause animal suffering, but that's only short term, and nuclear war is the only risk of solving it in the long term, which obviously outweighs because every year trillions of animals die. And second final focus literally got up and made that exact argument. And so like the judges were like, yeah, you preempted this in final, and second final focus kind of just like walked into that trap exactly. So that's something that you can do, and if done well, it looks really good for you, and you just kind of like gain a lot of aura. So I guess that's like uh mine. I guess that's like my entire speech. So like my entire lecture. Does anyone have any like questions? Yeah.
Leon, you should check the chat.
I assume that means no one has any questions. So,
Wait, I have an actual question. I have an actual
yeah, what's
question.
up?
What was one of your most strategic rounds that you've like gone for? What was a wacky strategy you employed in a recent debate?
Uh, there's that's a really good question actually. I think okay. I think the first one I'm going to talk about is round one of the King Round Robin, where we re went for the factory farming DA against this team, and we were just like, and essentially we kind of just pivoted to animal wipeout and was like, yeah, like we should kill everyone because animal suffering outweighs, and that's the only chance that we can minimize suffering.
Leon, do you actually care about animal suffering?
Yeah,
Wait, I have a question.
yeah,
So, about signposting,
yeah.
like, can you like explain how that works and like how to do it effectively?
Yeah, I think that signposting is mostly pretty simple. And you just want to make it very clear to your judge, like which argument you're going to. So you can be like, start on the deterrence DA, XYZ. Next, go to the like escalation advantage. And just make it clear, like, for example, if you flow separate contentions on separate sheets of paper, be like, now go to the like deterrence contention and then pause like a little bit, like not too much, but just pause a little bit if you notice the judge is like scrambling to like shift their paper um to like shift their paper to a certain flow. I think that would be pretty
Mhm.
useful.